Elijah kicked a pebble along the cracked sidewalk, watching it bounce ahead and skid to a stop near a rusted drain. The buildings around him stood like silent witnesses to years of neglect, their walls scarred with peeling paint and faded graffiti. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack, its weight a familiar burden. His mom, Amara, always told him to come straight home after school, but today was another day of scavenging. At 14, Elijah had learned that survival was about more than just staying out of trouble. It was about finding ways to make things just a little easier for his mom, who worked 2 jobs to keep the roof over their heads. Collecting scrap metal wasn't glamorous, but it was something he could do. The narrow alley behind Ortega's market always made him uneasy. The smell of rotting garbage hung heavy in the air, and the shadows between the buildings felt closer here. Mr. Ortega, the store's owner, was inside as usual, his sharp eyes following Elijah's every move through the grime-covered window. "Hey, kid," Mr. Ortega barked, cracking open the window. "What are you doing back here?" Elijah didn't stop walking. "Just passing through," he muttered, keeping his head down. The truth was, he hated how people in the neighborhood looked at him. Suspicion, distrust, like he was up to no good simply because he existed. Home was a 2-room apartment at the far end of a long, dimly lit hallway. Elijah pushed the door open and found his mom at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed over a stack of bills. Leah, his 10-year-old sister, was curled up on their shared couch, sketching with a blunt pencil on scrap paper. "Ma, I found some more today," Elijah said, emptying a handful of coins onto the table. Amara looked up, her tired eyes softening. "Thank you, sweetheart. Every little bit helps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How was school?" she asked, though the question felt more like a habit than genuine curiosity. "Same as always," Elijah replied with a shrug. He didn't want to tell her about the whispers behind his back or the stares he got from teachers. She had enough to worry about. Later, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Elijah went back out. The streets grew quieter, but the air still buzzed with the faint hum of passing cars and distant voices. Near a corner, he spotted an elderly man stumbling. The man's grocery bag tore open as he fell, sending oranges rolling across the pavement. For a moment, Elijah froze. People like that didn't usually want help from kids like him. They'd think he was trying to steal something. But then he saw the man's frail hands trembling as he tried to stand, and something inside Elijah told him he couldn't just walk away. "Hey, let me help you," Elijah said, kneeling beside the man. The old man looked up, his face lined with deep wrinkles and confusion in his eyes. Elijah quickly gathered the scattered oranges and handed them back before offering a steadying hand. "Thank you, son," the man said, his voice shaky. "These streets aren't as easy to navigate as they used to be. You sure you're okay to walk?" Elijah asked, glancing around. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on them, the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him. The man shook his head. "I'll manage, thanks to you," he said, smiling, a genuine smile that caught Elijah off guard. Elijah watched as the man shuffled away, his steps slow and deliberate. Then, picking up his sack, Elijah headed home, unaware of the man standing across the street, watching the entire interaction. When Elijah returned, the smell of onions filled the small apartment. Amara was stirring a pot on their stove, and Leah was sitting on the floor, surrounded by crayons and scrap paper. "Did you find enough scrap today, Eli?" Leah asked, her hopeful voice cutting through the quiet. Elijah knelt beside her and smiled. "Not much, but maybe tomorrow," he said, running a hand over her curly hair. Amara turned, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and worry. "You're doing so much, Elijah. Just don't overdo it, okay?" Elijah nodded, but he didn't know how to explain to her that he had to overdo it. If he didn't, who else would? That night, rain began to fall, dripping through the familiar leaks in their ceiling. Elijah lay on his bed, staring at the darkened spots where water collected and dripped into an old plastic bucket. Leah's soft breathing was a small comfort in the stillness of the room. He thought about the old man and the way his hands had trembled. Elijah hoped the man had made it home safely. He closed his eyes, wishing for a change, not just for himself, but for his mom and Leah. He didn't know that change was already on its way, and it would arrive in a way he never could have imagined. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the curtains, casting soft streaks across the apartment's worn walls. Elijah was already awake, his mind restless from the night before. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cool, but the faint dripping from the bucket near the bed reminded him that their problems hadn't disappeared overnight. He moved quietly through the apartment, careful not to wake Leah. His mother was already at the small kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug and staring out the window. "Morning, Ma," Elijah said, grabbing a piece of bread from the counter. Amara turned to him, giving him a tired smile. "Morning, Eli. You sleep okay?" "Yeah," he lied, taking a bite of the dry bread. Before she could ask anything else, there was a knock at the door. Elijah froze, his eyes darting to his mother. Visitors were rare in their part of town, and unexpected ones were never a good sign. Amara stood slowly, her movements cautious as she approached the door. She opened it a crack, peering out. Standing there was a man in a sharp black suit, his polished shoes glinting in the weak morning light. Behind him, a sleek black car idled at the curb, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of crumbling buildings. "Mrs. Carter?" the man asked, his voice smooth but firm. "Yes?" Amara replied, her tone wary. "My name is Victor Langston. May I come in? It's about your son, Elijah." Amara stiffened, her grip tightening on the door. Elijah stepped closer, his heart racing. "What about my son?" she asked, her voice guarded. Victor raised a hand in a calming gesture. "I wanted to thank him for helping my father yesterday. He's been unwell, and Elijah's kindness meant a great deal to him. I wanted to show my gratitude." Amara hesitated, her eyes flicking to Elijah. He shrugged, unsure of what to say. Finally, she opened the door wider, gesturing for Victor to enter. The man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small apartment. He took in the peeling paint, the patched furniture, and the bucket on the floor with a polite neutrality that made Elijah's skin crawl. "I hope I'm not intruding," Victor said, his tone cordial. "I wanted to personally thank you, Elijah, for what you did. It's not often that people take the time to help strangers." "It wasn't a big deal," Elijah muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "It was," Victor insisted, his sharp gaze locking onto Elijah. "And it's something I don't take lightly. I'd like to offer you and your family something in return." Amara raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Langston?" Victor smiled, reaching into his pocket to pull out a business card. "I own a small construction firm. We specialize in renovations and property improvements. I'd like to fix up your home. No charge, no strings attached. Just a way to show my appreciation." Elijah's stomach tightened. This was too much, too sudden. "We don't need charity," he said quickly, his voice firm. Amara shot him a look, silencing him. She turned back to Victor, her expression cautious but curious. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Langston, but why go so far? We're strangers to you." Victor's smile softened. "True, but my father spoke very highly of your son, and sometimes a small act of kindness deserves something more in return." Amara was quiet, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table. Elijah could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to accept help warring with her pride. "Can we think about it?" she finally asked. "Of course," Victor said, his tone understanding. He placed the business card on the table. "Take all the time you need. If you decide to go forward, just give me a call." He turned to Elijah, his eyes steady. "You did a good thing, Elijah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With that, Victor nodded politely and left, closing the door softly behind him. For a long moment, the apartment was silent. Amara picked up the card, turning it over in her hands. Elijah's chest felt tight as he watched her. "Ma, we don't know this guy," he said finally. "What if he's not what he seems?" Amara sighed, setting the card down. "I know, Eli, but look at this place. The leaks, the walls. We can't keep living like this. And I don't know how much longer I can do it on my own." Elijah didn't respond. He hated seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she carried the weight of everything on her shoulders. But accepting help from someone like Victor felt wrong. That afternoon, Elijah went about his usual route, collecting scrap from alleys and empty lots. But his mind kept drifting back to the black car, to Victor's perfectly polished shoes and smooth voice. As he passed by Ortega's market, he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered outside, their voices low and hushed. "You see that car?" one woman muttered. "Fancy thing like that doesn't belong here." "I heard it was parked by the Carter's place," another man said. "What do you think they're up to?" Elijah quickened his pace, his cheeks burning. He knew the rumors would spread like wildfire. The neighborhood thrived on suspicion, and people were always looking for someone to blame for their own hardships. He kept his head down, but the whispers followed him like shadows. When Elijah got home, Amara was sitting at the table, the business card still in front of her. Leah was drawing quietly in the corner, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Eli," Amara said, her voice soft. He looked up, his chest tightening. "Yeah, I think we should call him," she said. Elijah's heart sank. "Ma, we don't even know if we can trust him. People like that don't just give things away for free." "I know," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But we don't have many choices. And maybe, just maybe, this is the break we need." Elijah wanted to argue, to tell her they could figure it out on their own. But the words caught in his throat. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way hope was flickering to life despite her fear. "Okay," he said quietly, "but I'm going to keep an eye on him." Amara nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "We'll be careful, Eli. I promise." As she reached for the phone, Elijah sat down beside Leah, watching her draw. He felt a knot of unease settle deep in his stomach. Whatever Victor Langston wanted, Elijah knew it wasn't going to come without a price. The rumble of heavy trucks shattered the usual quiet of the morning. Elijah stood by the window, staring at the crew unloading tools and materials from their vehicles. They wore bright vests and hard hats, their loud chatter filling the air as they began transforming his family's home. It had only been 2 days since Amara had made the call. Victor Langston had wasted no time, sending a team to start renovations almost immediately. "It's happening," Amara said softly, standing beside Elijah. Her arms were crossed, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes that Elijah hadn't seen in years. "Yeah," Elijah muttered, not sharing her enthusiasm. He didn't trust Victor, didn't trust his motives. The work happening outside felt like the beginning of something they couldn't stop, something they didn't fully understand. Elijah stepped outside as the crew began their work. The porch was being dismantled, the old, rotting wood ripped away to make room for something new. The workers barely noticed him at first, too busy with their tasks. "You the kid who lives here?" one of them asked, a burly man with a scruffy beard. His name tag read Sam. "Yeah," Elijah said, shifting uncomfortably. "Well, if you're gonna watch, you might as well make yourself useful," Sam said with a grin, handing Elijah a hammer. Elijah hesitated, then took the tool. He wasn't sure if it was a test or a genuine offer, but he wasn't about to stand around while someone else worked on his home. The day wore on, and Elijah threw himself into the work. He carried planks of wood, handed out tools, and even helped hold boards in place while the crew nailed them down. By noon, sweat drenched his shirt, and his muscles ached, but he kept going. "You've got a good work ethic, kid," Sam said during a break, handing Elijah a bottle of water. "Not many your age would bother." Elijah nodded, too tired to respond. He didn't want their praise. He wanted their respect. But respect wasn't the only thing he noticed. Across the street, neighbors gathered in small groups, watching the construction with narrowed eyes and hushed whispers. When Elijah went inside to grab lunch, Amara was in the kitchen, her face flushed from excitement. "You've been out there all morning," she said, setting a plate of sandwiches on the table. "I'm not just going to sit back and let them do everything," Elijah replied, grabbing a sandwich. Leah looked up from her drawings, her eyes bright. "Are they really fixing the roof? No more leaks?" "Looks like it," Elijah said, managing a small smile. Amara sat across from him, her expression softening. "Eli, this is a good thing. It's okay to let people help us." Elijah didn't respond. He wasn't sure if it was okay. Every time he saw Victor's sleek black car parked by their curb, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Later that day, As Elijah hauled a stack of wooden planks across the yard, he saw Mr. Ortega standing by his store, arms crossed. The old man's glare was sharp enough to cut through steel. Elijah set the planks down and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What do you want, Mr. Ortega?" Ortega snorted. "What I want is to know what kind of deal you made with that man. People like him don't just hand out favors for free." Elijah's jaw tightened. "It's not a deal. He just wants to help." Ortega's eyes narrowed. "You're young, but you're not stupid. Rich men don't do anything without expecting something in return. Mark my words, boy. You and your family will pay for this one way or another." Elijah clenched his fists, anger bubbling in his chest. "Maybe you're wrong. Maybe not everyone's out to take something." Ortega just shook his head and walked back into his store, leaving Elijah standing there, his thoughts tangled. That night, Elijah sat by the window, watching the crew pack up for the day. The house was already starting to look different, the walls stripped, the roof patched. "I don't like how people are looking at us, Ma," Elijah said, his voice low. Amara glanced up from the table, where she was sorting through papers. "They don't understand, Eli. Let them talk. We're doing what's best for us." "Yeah, but what if Ortega's right? What if this all comes with a price?" Amara sighed, setting down her pen. "Maybe it does, but sometimes you have to take risks to get ahead. I'm doing this for you and Leah. I just need you to trust me." Elijah wanted to argue, but the exhaustion in her voice silenced him. She wasn't wrong. They couldn't keep living like they had been. But the idea of being in someone else's debt gnawed at him. The next day, Elijah threw himself into the work again, determined to prove he wasn't just a passive recipient of charity. The crew began treating him differently, trusting him with more responsibility. "Hey, kid," Sam called out, tossing him a pair of gloves. "We need someone to steady the ladder while we work on the siding. Think you can handle it?" "Yeah," Elijah said, slipping on the gloves. As he held the ladder steady, the other workers began to take notice. "You're not bad at this," one of them said. By the end of the day, they were joking with him, treating him like part of the team. Elijah felt a flicker of pride. Maybe he could turn this into something more than just charity. But not everyone saw it that way. As Elijah carried a stack of materials across the yard, he heard two neighbors talking near the fence. "Can you believe this?" one said. "Fancy cars, construction crews, they're probably hiding something. Bet they're mixed up in something shady," the other replied. Elijah gritted his teeth, his steps quickening. He couldn't escape the whispers, couldn't shake the feeling that his family was being judged for accepting help they desperately needed. That evening, Victor arrived in his black car. He stepped out, his suit immaculate as always, and walked up to the house. Amara greeted him at the door, her smile polite but cautious. "Elijah," Victor said, nodding at him, "I hear you've been helping the crew. Good work." Elijah crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not going to sit around and watch other people fix my house." Victor's smile widened slightly. "That's a good attitude to have. But remember, this is more than just about the house. It's about building something better, for all of you." Elijah's unease deepened. There was something in Victor's tone that felt heavier than the words themselves. "We'll talk more soon," Victor said, turning back to his car. "There's a lot to discuss." As the black car drove away, Elijah watched it until it disappeared around the corner. The whispers from the neighbors, the warnings from Ortega, Victor's cryptic words, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet put together. He turned back to the house, his fists clenching. Whatever was coming, he would face it head-on. The morning was quiet, but the air carried the damp chill left behind by the storm. Elijah woke to the faint sound of raindrops still dripping from the gutters outside. For once, the ceiling above his bed was dry, and the old bucket on the floor sat empty. Leah was still curled up on her small bed in the corner, her sketchbook lying open beside her. Elijah sat up, rubbing his eyes, but the unease from the day before lingered. Victor's words repeated in his mind. This isn't just about fixing a house. It's about building a future. By the time Elijah stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind thick clouds that hung low in the sky. The crew was already at work, their tools clattering and voices echoing across the street. Sam waved at Elijah as he approached. "Morning, kid. Ready to get back to it?" "Yeah," Elijah said, forcing a small smile. He grabbed a pair of gloves from the workbench and headed toward a pile of wood that needed moving. As Elijah hauled the planks to the yard, he caught sight of his neighbors. They weren't hiding anymore. They were standing in plain view, talking in low voices while glancing toward the house. Around mid-morning, Victor's black car arrived, gliding to a stop in front of the house. Elijah felt his stomach tighten as Victor stepped out, dressed in his usual sharp suit. Victor greeted the crew with a polite nod before turning to Elijah. "Elijah, can we talk for a moment?" Elijah hesitated, setting down the wood. He wiped his hands on his jeans and followed Victor to the side of the house, where they could speak privately. "I wanted to check in," Victor began, his voice calm. "You've been working hard, and that's good to see. But I hope you're also thinking about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Elijah asked, crossing his arms. Victor opened a leather folder he carried and held up a set of glossy pamphlets. "I have connections to schools and mentorship programs. These could open doors for you, help you build something better for yourself and your family." Elijah frowned. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Victor smiled faintly. "Because I see potential in you, Elijah, and I don't waste time or resources on people who won't make the most of what they're given." Elijah felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I'll think about it," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Good," Victor replied, closing the folder. "Remember, this isn't just about the house. It's about your future." Victor walked away, but Elijah stayed behind, staring at the muddy ground. Victor's words felt too smooth, too calculated. That evening, as the clouds darkened, Elijah stayed outside helping the crew. The wind began to pick up, tugging at the tarps that covered the materials. "Storm's coming in again," Sam said, tying down a stack of lumber. "You'd better head inside soon, Elijah." "Not yet," Elijah replied. He grabbed another tarp and pulled it over a pile of bricks, his hands working quickly against the rising wind. "Elijah!" A voice called from behind him. He turned to see Jonah running across the yard, his hoodie pulled tight against the cold. "What are you doing here?" Elijah asked, surprised. Jonah shrugged. "Figured you could use some help. Plus, everyone's been talking about this place. I wanted to see it for myself." "Then grab the other end of this tarp," Elijah said, grateful for the extra pair of hands. The rain began to fall harder, quickly soaking through their clothes. The wind whipped around them, threatening to tear the tarp from their grip. "Hold on," Elijah shouted, tying one end of the tarp down with a heavy brick. Jonah struggled with the other end, his face grim. "Man, this is getting bad. We should stop." "Not yet," Elijah yelled back, his voice barely audible over the storm. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. A piece of siding that had been leaning against the house came crashing down, splintering as it hit the ground. Elijah and Jonah jumped back, their hearts pounding. "That's it, we're done," Jonah said, grabbing Elijah's arm. Elijah hesitated, but the storm was growing worse. He nodded, and the two of them ran toward the house, slipping on the wet grass. Amara was waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. "Are you out of your minds?" she scolded, pulling them inside. "You could have been hurt out there." "I couldn't let the storm ruin everything," Elijah said, his voice defensive. Amara's hands trembled as she handed them towels. "I know you're trying to help, but you have to be careful, Elijah. We can't afford to lose you." "I'm sorry, Ma," Elijah muttered, drying his hair. Jonah grinned sheepishly. "He's stubborn, Mrs. Carter, but he's got a good heart." Amara let out a small laugh, though her eyes were still wet with worry. "That he does. Thank you, Jonah, for looking out for him." "No problem," Jonah said, shrugging. "That's what friends are for." The storm raged on through the night, the rain hammering against the windows. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents Victor had left behind. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Victor was hiding something. "You don't trust him, do you?" Jonah asked, sitting across from him. Elijah shook his head. "No, I don't. Something about him doesn't feel right." Jonah nodded. "People like him don't just show up to help. They always want something in return." "I know," Elijah said quietly. That's why I can't let my guard down. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the neighborhood drenched but calm. The crew returned early, resuming their work as though nothing had happened. Elijah joined them, hauling supplies and helping where he could. But as he worked, he noticed the neighbors watching again, their whispers louder than before. "I heard he's been talking to city officials," one woman said. "Something about big plans for the block. Probably using that family to get what he wants," another replied. Elijah clenched his fists, their words cutting deep. No matter how hard he worked, the neighborhood still doubted him and his family. That evening, Victor returned. His black car pulled up to the curb, its tires crunching against the gravel. Elijah stood in the yard, his arms crossed as Victor approached. "Elijah," Victor said, his tone smooth, "I hear you've been working hard. What do you want now?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp. Victor smiled faintly. "Just checking in. I know the whispers haven't been kind, but you shouldn't let them bother you. People fear what they don't understand." Elijah's chest tightened. Maybe they're right to be afraid. Victor's smile faded, but his tone remained calm. "You're overthinking this. Focus on what's in front of you. That's the only way to move forward." With that, he walked back to his car and drove away, leaving Elijah standing in the yard with a storm of emotions swirling inside him. That night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The whispers, Victor's words, and the warnings from Jonah all weighed heavily on him. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't ready for. Whatever it was, Elijah knew he couldn't face it alone. The morning air was heavy with humidity from the storm the night before. Elijah woke early, the rising sun casting faint light through the window. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, the unease in his chest growing heavier by the day. Victor's words played in his mind like an echo. This isn't just about fixing a house. It's about building a future. What future? And at what cost? The work on the house continued that day, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The crew was making fast progress, faster than Elijah had expected. By mid-morning, the new siding was nearly complete, and the freshly patched roof gleamed in the sunlight. "You're looking a little distracted, kid," Sam said, leaning on a pile of lumber. Elijah forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Sam studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But don't let it eat you up. You're doing good work here." Elijah appreciated the sentiment, but the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. That afternoon, Victor arrived, as he had been doing almost daily. His black car glided to a stop at the curb, and he stepped out, carrying a sleek leather folder under his arm. Elijah was hauling a stack of bricks to the yard when Victor called out to him. "Elijah, can we talk?" Elijah hesitated, setting the bricks down. He wiped his hands on his jeans and followed Victor to the side of the house. "I wanted to share some updates," Victor began, opening the folder to reveal a stack of documents. Elijah glanced at the papers, his unease growing. "Updates about what?" Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The neighborhood. I've been in discussions about improving the area, bringing in new developments. Your family's home is part of that vision, a symbol of what's possible with the right support." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of developments?" Victor's tone remained calm, almost too calm. "New housing, better infrastructure. It's all part of a long-term plan to revitalize the area." "And what happens to the people already living here?" Elijah asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Victor's smile faltered slightly. "This is about progress, Elijah. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. Trust me, your family will benefit from this." Elijah clenched his fists. "I don't want to be part of some plan to push people out of their homes." Victor closed the folder, his expression hardening. "You're overthinking this. Focus on the opportunities I'm giving you. Don't let fear cloud your judgment." With that, Victor walked back to his car, leaving Elijah standing in the yard, his mind racing. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the business card Victor had left months ago. He turned it over in his hands, the glossy finish catching the light. "What's wrong, Eli?" Amara asked, setting down a cup of tea. He hesitated. "Victor's up to something, Ma. I don't know what it is, But it's not just about helping us. He's talking about big changes to the neighborhood, developments and all that. Amara frowned, her tired eyes narrowing. Developments? What does that mean? I think he wants to use our house to show off, to get people to agree to his plans, Elijah said. But what happens to everyone else? What happens to us when he's done? Amara sat down heavily, her hands trembling slightly as she held her cup. I don't know, Eli. But he's done so much already. It's hard to believe he'd do all this just to hurt people. Elijah's voice rose, frustration bubbling to the surface. That's the point, Ma. He's not doing this for us. He's doing it for himself. We're just part of his scheme. Amara didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the table. Determined to find answers, Elijah decided to take matters into his own hands. That night, while the neighborhood was quiet, he grabbed his hoodie and slipped out the door. Where are you going? Leah's small voice stopped him. She was standing in the hallway, clutching her sketchbook. Just out for a bit, Elijah said, ruffling her hair. Go back to bed, okay? Leah nodded reluctantly, her eyes worried as she watched him leave. Elijah made his way to Victor's office, a sleek building on the edge of the city. He knew it was risky, but he needed to see what Victor was hiding. The building was mostly empty, the night staff sparse. Elijah found an unlocked window and slipped inside, his heart pounding. Navigating the hallways, he found Victor's office and eased the door open. The space was pristine, with a large desk and shelves lined with files. Elijah rifled through the documents, his hands shaking as he searched for anything that could confirm his suspicions. Finally, he found it, a stack of contracts and blueprints detailing Victor's plans. The documents outlined a massive redevelopment project that would replace most of the neighborhood with luxury apartments and commercial spaces. Elijah's stomach turned. The plans included his family's house as a model property to win public support. He was right. Victor wasn't saving the neighborhood. He was destroying it. As Elijah stuffed the papers back into the folder, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. The door opened, and Victor stepped inside, his sharp gaze landing on Elijah. Well, Victor said, his tone cold, I wasn't expecting you to take such an interest in my work. Elijah backed away, clutching the folder. You're using us. All this, fixing our house, helping my mom, it's just to get what you want. Victor sighed, closing the door behind him. You're a smart kid, Elijah, but you're looking at this the wrong way. Progress always comes at a cost. Your family will come out ahead. I promise you that. What about everyone else? Elijah demanded. The people you'll force out? The ones who can't fight back? Victor's expression hardened. This isn't your fight, Elijah. Take what I'm offering and stay out of the rest. You're in no position to challenge me. Elijah's chest tightened, anger and fear swirling inside him. We didn't ask for this, and we're not going to let you ruin everything. Victor took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. Careful, Elijah. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. Elijah left the office, his hands trembling as he clutched the documents. He knew the fight ahead would be difficult, but he couldn't let Victor's plans go unchecked. When he got home, Amara was waiting in the living room, worry etched across her face. Where have you been? She asked. Elijah held up the folder. Getting the truth. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, the folder of documents spread out in front of him. His mother stood by the sink, her arms crossed and her brow furrowed. Leah sat quietly in the corner, sketching on a piece of scrap paper, her usual cheerfulness replaced by quiet curiosity about the tension in the room. Elijah, Amara said, her voice low and trembling. What is all this? It's proof, Ma, Elijah replied, his voice thick with frustration. Victor's not just helping us. He's using us. These papers show his plans to tear down most of the neighborhood and build luxury apartments. Our house? It's just a tool to sell his idea. Amara stared at the documents, her face pale. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Elijah said, pushing the papers toward her. Just read it. He's not helping us for free, Ma. There's always a price. But he's done so much already, Amara whispered, as if trying to convince herself. The house, the roof, he's been so kind to us. Elijah's voice rose, anger breaking through. That's the whole point. He makes it look like he's helping, but all he's doing is trapping us. We're not his charity. We're his leverage. Leah looked up from her drawing, her small voice breaking the tense silence. Are we going to lose our home? Elijah's anger softened immediately. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. No, Leah, I promise. We're going to fight this. The next day, Elijah met Jonah at their usual spot behind an old warehouse. The two friends sat on a stack of crates, the folder of documents between them. Jonah flipped through the papers, his eyes widening. Man, this is bad. He's got the whole thing planned out. It's not just your house. It's the whole block. Elijah nodded grimly. I need to do something, but I can't do it alone. Jonah frowned, deep in thought. We need to get the neighbors on board. If everyone sees this, they'll have to stand up together. They don't trust us, Elijah said, bitterness creeping into his tone. They think we're already part of Victor's plan. Then we prove them wrong, Jonah said firmly. We show them the truth. That evening, Elijah and Jonah went door to door, sharing the documents with their neighbors. At first, most people refused to listen, slamming doors in their faces or brushing them off with suspicious glances. Why should we believe you? One man said, his arms crossed over his chest. You've already taken his money. Now you want us to do what? Trust you? We didn't take his money, Elijah said, his voice firm. We're in the same position as you. If we don't fight this together, none of us will have a home left. Slowly, word began to spread. A few neighbors started to listen, their skepticism giving way to curiosity as they saw the evidence Elijah carried. By the time the sun set, a small group had gathered in the courtyard of their apartment complex. Elijah stood in the center, his hands trembling as he held the folder. I know you don't trust me, Elijah began, his voice steady despite the weight of their stares. But this isn't just about my family. It's about all of us. If we don't stop Victor now, he's going to destroy this neighborhood. And once it's gone for good. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mr. Ortega stepped forward, his sharp eyes narrowing at Elijah. You're asking a lot, Ortega said. If this backfires, we could lose everything. Elijah met his gaze, his jaw set. If we don't fight, we'll lose everything anyway. At least this way, we have a chance. Ortega was silent for a moment before nodding. All right, kid. I'm in. The crowd began to murmur their agreement, one by one pledging their support. The next few days were a blur of activity. Elijah, Jonah, and the neighbors worked together to gather more evidence and prepare their case. They printed flyers, wrote letters, and even reached out to local reporters, hoping to draw attention to Victor's plans. The whispers in the neighborhood changed. No longer were they about suspicion and betrayal. Instead, they were filled with determination. But Victor wasn't idle. One afternoon, as Elijah walked home from another meeting with the neighbors, he noticed the black car parked outside his house. His heart sank. Inside, he found Victor sitting at the kitchen table, his expression calm but his eyes cold. Amara stood nearby, her hands clenched tightly together. Elijah, Victor said, his tone sharp. We need to talk. Elijah dropped his backpack by the door, his chest tightening. What do you want? Victor stood, towering over him. I know what you've been doing. Stirring up trouble, spreading lies. I've been nothing but generous to your family, and this is how you repay me. It's not lies, Elijah shot back, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. I saw the plans, Victor. I know what you're doing. Victor's expression darkened. You're making a mistake, Elijah. This fight is bigger than you, and if you keep pushing, you're going to get hurt. Do you understand me? Elijah's fists clenched, his voice rising. No, you're the one making a mistake. We're not just going to let you take everything. You can't scare us into staying quiet. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You should think very carefully about your next move, Elijah. You don't want to make an enemy out of me. Amara stepped forward, placing herself between them. That's enough, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Get out of my house, Victor. Victor's eyes flicked to her, then back to Elijah. You're making a big mistake, he said before turning and walking out the door. That night, Elijah sat with his mom and Leah, their small living room filled with a heavy silence. "I'm sorry, Ma," Elijah said finally. Amara shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. "Don't be sorry, Eli. You're doing what's right. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Leah climbed into Elijah's lap, wrapping her small arms around him. "We're not going to let him win, right?" Elijah hugged her tightly, his resolve hardening. "No, we're not. I promise." The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets of the neighborhood. Elijah stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by a growing crowd of neighbors. The whispers had stopped. Now the air buzzed with determination. Jonah stood beside him, holding a stack of flyers with bold, black letters. "Save our homes. Stop the Langston development." "You ready for this?" Jonah asked, his voice low. Elijah took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the edges of the folder that contained Victor's plans. "Ready or not, we don't have a choice." The plan was simple but risky. Confront Victor publicly during his scheduled press conference and reveal the truth to the media. The event was meant to showcase Victor's so-called philanthropy in revitalizing the neighborhood. Elijah and the neighbors were determined to expose it for the exploitation it truly was. As the time approached, the group made their way to the park where the press conference was being set up. The atmosphere was tense, but Elijah could feel the strength of the community around him. Amara walked at his side, her face a mix of worry and resolve. Leah held her hand tightly, clutching one of her drawings, a picture of their house, bright and whole. "We're doing the right thing, Ma," Elijah said, his voice steady. Amara nodded. "I know, Eli. I just hope it's enough." The park was already crowded when they arrived. A stage had been set up, flanked by banners displaying Victor's smiling face and slogans like "Building a Brighter Future." Reporters with cameras and microphones milled about, waiting for the event to begin. Victor stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and flashing his polished smile. He looked completely at ease, as if the fight brewing around him was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Elijah clenched his fists. "Let's go." The press conference began with Victor addressing the crowd, his voice smooth and confident. "This project is about more than just construction," he said. "It's about hope. It's about giving back to a community that deserves better. The Carter family's home is just the first step in a long-term plan to revitalize this neighborhood." A ripple of applause spread through the audience, but it was interrupted by a sharp voice cutting through the noise. "That's a lie." All eyes turned to Elijah, who stood at the edge of the crowd with the folder held high. Jonah and the neighbors flanked him, their faces set with determination. Victor's smile faltered. "Elijah," he said, his tone dripping with feigned warmth. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to tell the truth," Elijah said, stepping forward. He held up the documents for everyone to see. "You're not saving this neighborhood. You're destroying it." Gasps rippled through the crowd as reporters turned their cameras toward him. "What are you talking about?" one of the reporters asked, thrusting a microphone in Elijah's direction. Elijah opened the folder, pulling out the blueprints and contracts. "Victor's development plan isn't about helping us. It's about tearing down our homes and replacing them with luxury apartments and stores. He's using my family to sell his vision, but once he's done, we'll all be gone." The reporters swarmed him, snapping photos and shouting questions. Victor's composure cracked, his expression darkening. "That's enough," he said sharply, stepping toward Elijah. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Elijah shot back, his voice rising. "These papers prove it. You're trying to push us out, and we're not going to let you." The neighbors rallied behind him, their voices joining the outcry. "We won't be silenced. Save our homes. Langston is a fraud." Victor tried to regain control, addressing the crowd with a strained smile. "This is a misunderstanding. My intentions have always been to improve this community." "Then why hide your plans?" Mr. Ortega shouted from the crowd. "Why didn't you tell us the truth?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but the reporters weren't letting up. They peppered him with questions, demanding explanations. Elijah stepped closer, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You think you can bully us into silence? Well, We're not afraid of you. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it." The crowd erupted into cheers, the unity of the neighborhood on full display. The press conference ended in chaos. Victor retreated to his car, his polished facade shattered. Reporters continued to hound him, cameras flashing as he climbed into the black vehicle and drove away. Elijah stood in the middle of the crowd, the adrenaline coursing through him. For the first time, he felt like he had won a battle in a war he hadn't chosen but refused to lose. That night, the neighborhood gathered in the courtyard, the atmosphere charged with energy and hope. People who had once whispered about the Carters now approached them with gratitude and admiration. "You did good, kid," Mr. Ortega said, patting Elijah on the shoulder. Jonah grinned. "Told you they'd listen." Amara pulled Elijah into a hug, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Eli." Leah held up her drawing, a triumphant smile on her face. "I knew we could save our house." Elijah looked around at the faces of his neighbors, his family, and his friends. They had stood together, and for the first time, he felt like they could truly make a difference. The fight wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, but the first step had been taken. The community had found its voice, and they weren't going to let anyone take it away. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the buildings, casting a soft glow over the courtyard where Elijah stood. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, the air carrying a rare sense of calm. The events of the press conference had sent shockwaves through the area. Overnight, news of Victor Langston's plans had spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of local activists and city officials. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of forgotten streets. It was the center of a growing movement. Elijah leaned against the repaired porch railing of his home, his arms crossed as he watched Leah chalking colorful shapes onto the sidewalk. Amara stepped out, her expression soft but thoughtful. "You've done something amazing, Eli," she said, leaning beside him. "This neighborhood feels alive again because of you." "It wasn't just me," Elijah replied, his gaze distant. "Everyone had to stand together to make it happen. That's what saved us." Amara smiled, her hand brushing his shoulder. "Still, I'm proud of you. You stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Not everyone would have had the courage." Elijah didn't reply immediately. His thoughts drifted to the fight that still lay ahead. Victor hadn't been defeated completely, he was just forced to retreat for now. The contracts and plans they exposed were enough to halt the project temporarily, but Elijah knew the battle wasn't over. Later that day, the neighbors gathered in the courtyard again, this time to celebrate their first victory. Tables were set up with homemade dishes, the air filled with the scent of fried chicken, rice, and fresh bread. Elijah moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. Jonah appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "Here," he said, handing one to Elijah. "You're the hero of the day. Might as well drink like one." Elijah chuckled, taking the cup. "It's not over yet, you know." "I know," Jonah said, grinning. "But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy the win. You've got to celebrate the small victories, man." Elijah nodded, his smile widening. "You're right. We earned this." As the sun began to set, Elijah stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke. "We've come a long way, but this is just the beginning," he said. "Victor might be gone for now, but people like him don't give up easily. We have to stay united. We have to keep fighting for our homes, for our future." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy filling the courtyard. Mr. Ortega stepped forward, a rare smile on his face. "We'll be ready, kid. You've shown us what we can do when we stand together." Amara joined Elijah on the makeshift stage, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. Leah ran up, holding one of her drawings high. It was a picture of their house, surrounded by smiling faces and bright colors. "This is our home," Leah shouted, her voice ringing clear. The neighbors cheered again, their voices echoing into the evening. That night, Elijah sat on the porch with Amara and Leah, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. The house looked almost unrecognizable, solid, repaired, and full of life. "You think we'll be okay now?" Leah asked, leaning against Elijah's side. Elijah wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. Yeah, Leah, I think we will. Amara smiled, her hand resting on Elijah's shoulder. We're stronger now, Eli, and we have you to thank for that. Elijah shook his head. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. They sat in silence for a while, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. In the days that followed, Elijah worked alongside the neighbors to strengthen their newfound unity. They formed a committee to ensure their voices were heard in city meetings. They reached out to activists and legal advocates, building alliances to protect their homes from future threats. Victor Langston was gone, but Elijah knew he hadn't given up entirely. That didn't matter, though. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't waiting for someone to save them. They were saving themselves. The house stood as a symbol of resilience, not just for Elijah and his family, but for the entire community. It was a reminder that justice didn't come easily, but it was always worth fighting for. As the sun rose over the neighborhood each morning, Elijah felt a sense of hope he hadn't known before. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it together. And together, they would endure.